Good afternoon, gentlemen, and for all those of you who are in the audience and perhaps watching us. By the way, Christian, when does this get rebroadcast? Okay, fair enough. The only agenda item for today's meeting was to hear Selectman Begley's report on her research related to McKinney-Vento. Unfortunately, she has had a dental accident, which has precluded her from being here this afternoon. So in the interest of time, I think we can make this a very short meeting. Nevertheless, I do want to report on my own research, which is both curious as well as perhaps positive. It's curious in the fact that when I spoke to the member of the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education, is that their correct title now?
It's SE, Elementary and Secondary
Education, yes. Who will actually be running this program, a gentleman by the name of Jay Sullivan, who I had not been able to reach prior to the last meeting. He indicated that the number that I received from the state auditor's office was a preliminary number and would not in any way be the basis for reimbursement. So that number, as people may recall, was $125,270. Actually, I probably didn't have that number until the school committee meeting, now that I think about it. But in any event, that number, which I publicly used at the school committee meeting, or the public hearing of the school committee, it is a legitimate number in the sense that it was used to develop the amount appropriated by the legislature, but it is not, in fact, the number that will be used to form the basis of any reimbursement. That number will be based on our actual costs to be submitted by the school department as part of its annual report, which Anna Miranda is in the process of developing as we speak. Barry, can you give me a time frame for when that's likely to be submitted?
October 1st.
Okay, so on October 1st, we will submit a lot of numbers to the State Department of Elementary and Secondary Education, and one of those numbers will be the actual costs associated with the transportation of the homeless children either to or from Wareham. Now, the good news of this is that while the number 125,270 was a substantial number, it turns out that we actually spent substantially more than that number, approximately $167,000. Now, before we get too excited, that 167 is the basis upon which we will be reimbursed, but it is dependent upon what other communities submit and how much has been appropriated. So, for example, if all of the communities in the Commonwealth went up the approximately, let's call it 1/3 more than the original estimate, then everybody would be prorated down by a 25%, to be mathematically correct, so that you'd end up getting, in essence, the estimate that the auditor gave us. If our costs went up disproportionately more, then we would get disproportionately more than the 125. If our costs went up disproportionately less, then we would get less than the 125. So the fact is, we don't really know how much, but if there's a good news part of the story, it's the fact that because our costs, in fact, went up, we have the opportunity to get that much more because the amount of the appropriation was, in fact, based upon the estimates. Have I created any questions for the people at this table so far? Okay. The only other thing he said that would be mildly enlightening is that they will be examining, he actually used the word auditing, the numbers to the extent that they are dramatically different than the original estimates that he received. He literally used the famous Ronald Reagan saying, "We trust but we verify." So it remains to be seen how long it will take for this entire process, but when I asked him that, he said it would not be, in any circumstances, it would not be until the spring that actual cash would be received. So my recommendation, assuming we can get consensus that this is in fact school district monies, is that we appropriate based on our costs, but be exceedingly cautious, because this is the first year of this program, in any spending associated with it, meaning that perhaps we should not spend any more than $125,000, as an example, and then just be happy if we end up getting more than that. In any event, even if it was, quote, only $125,000, that should more than cover any deficit that we're likely to incur, assuming the revolver continues to function the way it has historically, and our maintenance costs don't dramatically rise, because it was a deficit after the transportation revolver of less than $100,000 for fiscal year 12. I'll pause again for questions or comments.
I had a visit by Attorney Bowen and Claire Smith this afternoon, and we discussed the article to come before October town meeting, and I was told that perhaps in the article there would be a sum of money, then underneath it in the explanation would be the $125,000. That would allow, if more money came in, for that to flow, according to Attorney Bowen. In other words, you can't lessen it. Once you put in a thing of money, it can't go below that, but it can go above if more came in. So they're working on that, and I'm supposed to have the Attorney Bowen's language for Wednesday evening that I can pass out to the school board, and then hopefully when we go to FinCom as well.
I'm not quite clear. Are you saying that the motion itself would have the phrase "a sum of money"?
As when we did the debt exclusions, it first had a sum of money. The actual number was contained within the explanation. And there's a reason for that legally that I cannot explain to you.
I can almost guarantee, especially from my experience on the FinCom, I can almost guarantee that town meeting will not find it acceptable to have the phrase "a sum of money." They will want a specific sum. So we need, if that is in fact legally acceptable, we need to have Attorney Bowen well armed to deal with the likely objections from members of the town meeting.
And your math does work, because the claim of $167,000, 75% of that comes out exactly to $125,250. So, you know, $125,000, I believe, is being prudent.
John?
I just had one question regarding for the fall town meeting. You have this article going in looking for an additional $125,000. That's on the expense side. On the revenue side, there's the anticipation of X number of dollars coming in the spring. How are we going to match those up for the budget? Are we allowed to take estimates when setting the tax rate? We need to have a balanced budget. So we get our state aid numbers, and it will say $12 million or X number of dollars coming into the town. We're going to raise $125,000 more. What covers that from the other side, on the state aid side?
That's something that's going to have to be discussed. As I said to them, this money is money that is will not be spent until June of next year, when it comes time to balance that budget. In other words, it's not part of the expenditures. So it isn't money that is going to be going out the door. It's at the end when we find that we have a larger deficit than what is in the revolving account is why we need this additional revenue.
So it should be a spring article.
Or it can come out of a place that already contains the money, and then that reimburses when it comes. For instance, I believe we may have $300,000+ in a reserve account. Just for discussion purposes.
Mr. Heath?
Let's be careful with that reserve account, because the bulk of the money that's in there, over 200,000, is also going to be the subject of a warrant article in the fall meeting because it's associated with the vocational school. I expect that reserve account to drop to $100,000.
Yeah, I would have an even point number 2 if I was on the FinCom about the use of the reserve account for that purpose. So I don't think that's the right way to go.
If we don't put the money in October town meeting, then we can't use it this fiscal year. Is that correct?
It could be used if it was appropriated as part of a special town meeting in April.
So, that's another possibility that should be discussed to find out what is the proper way to do it.
I think while there are obviously some mechanics associated with this from a financial perspective, Attorney Bowen, your timing is flawless. Would you please?
That's a matter of perspective.
Yes, it is. Would you join us? We are talking about the warrant article associated with McKinney-Vento. There are a couple of questions.
Just email to
There are a couple of questions. One is, assuming, and make sure your mic is on, please. Assuming the law says that the motion can say a sum of money, it is my feeling, and perhaps others as well, that if that's the case, town meeting voters are going to want a lot of legal backing for that being a legitimate motion on which they will be voting, because they are so used to having that sum of money, which frequently says that in the warrant article, but when the motion comes, that phrase is converted into an actual dollar sum. So are you comfortable that that's likely to be the motion, simply a sum of money with an explanation of why it is such in the explanation part of the package?
Well, with your permission, Mr.
Please.
Chairman, whoever you are. Mr. Chairman. Okay. The way I drafted up the article was to see if the town will vote to transfer from available funds the sum of $125,000 as reimbursement for the town's costs of McKinney-Vento student transportation for homeless students, or take any other action relative thereto. I think that's pretty much what I did. Now, the reason why I put a specific dollar amount is that, number one, it's customary for the motion to identify a specific dollar amount. That's what the voters expect. But I think almost more importantly, from an accounting point of view, the accountant needs to have a sum certain to properly reconcile the books. Now, the only opportunity you'd have to use a motion which said, quote unquote, a sum of money would be if there was some enabling legislation that allowed it to be an open-ended appropriation. That would be a very unusual circumstance. Now, I know in years past, and at this point I'm going back maybe 15, 20, even 30 years, the only similar example you'd have of that would be in the annual appropriation of Chapter 90 funds. There was a time when an article would say to see if the town will vote to appropriate a sum of money for Chapter 90. The state would, there would be a motion that would use a phrase, a sum of money, and then at some point the state would send along however much highway money it was going to send along. In recent years, the Department of Revenue has taken the position that they prefer to see a motion with a specific dollar number. Now, for you and for anybody who happens to be listening to this. I'm using the Chapter 90 situation as an analogy. The analogy is that if the Department of Revenue is looking for specific dollar amounts in a motion for Chapter 90, absent some special legislation of which I am unaware, they will probably want a dollar figure in your motion for this. I had an opportunity to speak to Dr. Rabinovich about this an hour or two ago, and I think you'd be in the situation where if more money, I understand that you have to submit a claim, it has to be reviewed and so forth. If at some point you were lucky enough to get more than $125,000, indeed would be all fortunate and blessed by that event, and then at a subsequent town meeting, probably in a special town meeting within an annual town meeting in April, you would have an article on the warrant for a sum certain to appropriate that money out of the general fund and into whatever the account was you were going to use it in.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, you seem to be saying the motion, in fact, would have a specific dollar amount in it.
Yeah, I just gave a long-winded answer that boiled down to yes.
Good, because that was the opposite of what I thought you were going to say, so I'm comfortable. John?
Now, you voted that, you mentioned in the motion from available funds. The money's not coming in until the spring, the actual dollar amount. When we're setting our tax rate, when we're putting forward a balanced budget, it's if we don't have an estimate from the state or we don't have something in writing, what is that going to be? What are the available funds that you're voting from?
Yeah, I certainly would defer to your considerable expertise as treasurer and that of the accountant in managing the accounts. Smart people go into money management, the rest of us become lawyers. My view of it is that, say you went with a motion for $125,000 or any specific sum. Really what you're doing is you're creating a placeholder for purposes of setting your tax rate. In effect, that's what you do with all of your revenue. The day that we vote our budget in April or even on July 1st of the fiscal year, we don't have all the money available to fund the amounts that we borrowed. The revenue comes in incrementally. And I think this is essentially the same situation. The $125,000 is a placeholder. Assuming it's a conservative estimate as to the amount that you're going to get, and I would certainly urge a conservative estimate because you will short yourselves in setting the tax rate if you end up getting less. But using a conservative estimate, that placeholder will let you get your tax rate set, and then when the money flows in, just as it does incrementally with tax revenues, this will flow in and you will have it.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, make a conservative estimate on both the expense and a matching number on the revenue side. The enabling legislation and the appropriation at the state level legitimize the revenue side of the picture, and as long as we have not been, and it seems to me that's up to the town administrator and the finance committee to make that determination, as long as it is not considered to be an excessively high conservative estimate, so to speak, then it would simply be a pass-through and a wash on the budget. Now, the final point here is there any reason why this should be a October town meeting action versus an April special town meeting action?
You know, I can't answer that because every action has with it unintended consequences, and I would really have to puzzle over what the unintended consequences of that might be. That being said, any act that you don't want to overestimate in October because that will have a negative impact on your tax rate. If you come in pretty close, or forget about if you come in very conservatively and you get more money than you anticipated, that's certainly something that you could deal with in April. So to my way of thinking, and keeping in mind that I came here just to let the town administrator know I had locked his office, with that caveat, uh, it seems like there would be fewer unintended consequences with an extremely conservative estimate for October, and then you could take necessary remedial action, if I can phrase it that way, in April.
And it would seem almost the definition of conservative would be using a number that was the basis for determining the total amount appropriated at the state level. I mean, that's certainly conservative.
Certainly, if the state can give you some estimate.
And they have.
Yeah.
And they have.
To me, that would sound like a reasonable projection. If the state's telling you you're going to get X, and you use X as your projection.
And we've actually spent Y, which is greater, which means there might be some upside, but at least we've perhaps minimized the chances of any downside. Okay. Does anybody on the committee have any further questions for Mr. Bowen, or should we allow him to escape? Thank you, sir.
Oh, you're welcome, Mr. Chairman. John, I locked your office. And turn the light out, too.
Any further comments or questions from the committee? Yes.
We have a meeting this Monday with the Department of Revenue. So at that time, we could also run that by them. And it's something new. I'm sure it's something new to them, and a lot of communities would be dealing with that. And we have Jared Curtis, our rep, from the Bureau of Local Accounts coming in. So he's the perfect person to run that by.
And Jerry Perry was the person I spoke to get all these names, so he's quite familiar with the fact that it's really a DESI run reimbursement program, and but I agree, it's a great opportunity to make sure we're on the same page, given that it's a new program. Okay. We were hoping to hear from Ellen, because Ellen was the lone dissenting voice with respect to this money coming to the school district in whatever form, by whatever process it does. But since she is not here, John, you abstained. Is there any further information that you would like to receive, perhaps from DOR would be helpful, that would turn that abstention into either a negative or a positive?
No, that wasn't my concern. My only reason for abstaining in the last vote is because I didn't realize if this was the charge of this committee. It was my first meeting. I didn't know if it was discussing in-house busing or contract busing. I didn't know financing was actually the annual funds appropriated for busing was actually part of this committee, and that's why I abstained.
Okay. I think it's fair to say that the charge for this committee was to come up with a long-term plan to provide transportation to our school children. We don't have, at least I don't have, and I don't think the committee in general has, any feelings as to how it should be done. We just want to make sure it is done and done safely and cost-effectively. So it's pretty open-ended. Having said that, there's some urgency because of the age of the fleet, the deficit, et cetera. Frankly, this McKinney-Vento money is manna from heaven, as they say, because without it, we would have to be looking at other options, which, as we discussed at the previous meeting, would almost inevitably result in cuts in services. However, I want to make clear that the McKinney-Vento money does not solve the long-term plan for maintaining the fleet. It gets us through the operational budget problem for FY13, but until we have a consensus on the committee as to how we go forward to keep the fleet at some minimal level of age, or say maximum level of age would be more accurate, I don't think the committee's work is done. I would like to have Selectman Begley here for this conversation, but I think it's also fair to say that if this committee decided that RFPs should be sent out and they should come out of your office with our assistance, just to give the political leadership and the citizens of Wareham comfort level that we have looked at everything possible, and it just costs a certain amount of money and we're just going to have to come up with it, I think it's fair to say, I personally wouldn't be opposed to doing that. But this McKinney-Vento money gives us a Band-Aid on the problem, and it decreases the urgency, as long as there is consensus that it's something that should, in fact, go to the Transportation Department. So I promised a short meeting since we don't have Selectman Begley here to give her report. Does anybody have anything else they'd like to share with the committee? Mr. Heath.
What I can add to the discussion is that Mass Municipal Association does put out basically a quarterly bulletin. And in that this most recent quarterly bulletin, in fact, they do reference the bills signed by the governor. And let me just read you one quick paragraph. It says, in addition, the governor approved $11.3 million to reimburse cities and towns for the cost of a mandate to transport certain students living in temporary housing. Earlier this year, Auditor Susan Bump determined that the state acceptance of the federal McKinney-Vento Act related to the education of homeless students was an unfunded state mandate under the state's local mandate law. Also in the article, it mentions that the bill was initiated by the legislature, right, to reimburse for the homeless. So there is documentation out there, but no formal written thing, opinion from somebody. But Mass Municipal, everybody is using this bulletin, I think, to decide what they're going to do.
Barry?
Not to prolong the meeting, but one of the charges of the committee, which we have not got to, is what is the long-term plan. And if we keep services at the level they are, then whether we go out and have an independent contractor or we do it ourselves, it is going to cost the amount of money that it costs us, and in my opinion, if we go out, even more money. And we are going to the Board of Selectmen, I believe, on the 21st of August to discuss the McKinney-Vento. I believe we were asked.
I haven't received the formal invitation, but I know that Mrs. Begley asked for us to be put on the agenda, and I believe Mr. Holmes said he intended to do so.
Right, okay. So at some point, we will be there to discuss, hopefully, the motion for town meeting, but it may also give us the opportunity to ask the next question, which is, what is the Board of Selectmen's position on moving forward to solve the problem of the long-term problem of student transportation?
Okay? Anything else? Okay, I would like to leave it to you, John, to connect with Selectman Begley and see if you can propose a date once she has recovered from her injury. We'll await hearing from you in terms of setting another date. So with that said, I'll accept a motion to adjourn.
Second?
We're adjourned. Thank you very much.